Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I should really come up with an advanced spiel for that, considering it's relatively new. So this next short story is entitled from the this next short story from the Radicalized short story collection by Cory Doctorow is entitled Model Minority. And to call it a short story is slightly stressing the definition of that term nearly to the breaking point, as it's like 80 pages long. I may have to break this up in half, but there aren't really any clear and obvious chapter breaks, sadly, from what I remember. I'm flipping through it right now to see if there are. And if there are sort of breaks. How long is that? That's doable. How long is the second chunk? That is also doable. Okay, so tentatively, we're splitting this in half as the world burns outside. Hopefully nobody can hear that. Yeah, tell me if any of it seems slightly familiar to you. Maybe just a tiny bit. Let's get through this first half chunk of it, and we'll go from there. Let's just say it says quite a lot about the United States immigration policy and its outlook towards people of a foreign extraction, if you will. This sort of thing will keep coming up, probably, uh, in really any worthwhile modern science fiction that's dealing with sociological issues. So you're going to see it in Gregg, you're going to see it here. There's a couple really good Gregg ones that sort of dance around the topic and deal with it directly. I've already read one. Zendegi almost counts in its way, although that's more about kind of an on-the-ground perspective of, in a lot of ways, it's an on-the-ground perspective of the Arab Spring, if anybody remembers that. Um, so, good times. So, tentatively, let's get cracking. Let me just skip through here real quick. Is that close to the halfway point or not? Put it there for now. Okay. So this is quite a shift from the first short story. Um, Again, at the end of the month, I'll have them all organized into their proper playlists, so they'll be much easier to get at. I try to make sure I have that current. I know sometimes it's still problematic, um, partly because sometimes I put them in the wrong order. I want to blame YouTube for them being in the wrong order, but I can't guarantee that it's its fault and not mine. It's probably mine. I gotta PM that guy. Talk to him later. Okay, so without further ado, I think that's enough. I'm not gonna have a afterward article, I don't think, for this one, unless something happens in the next week or so. I'm not going to hammer on certain current events either, although it would be easy to do. Um, yeah, with that, we'll get started. Yes, well, thanks for tuning in, Warren Steele. Sometimes it's cold, it's dry, and when it's cold and dry, and people's primary form of heating is wood fires and or stoves or similar, burning things, well, stuff happens. So it's going to happen less frequently come the spring and summer, but more frequently come the fall generally. Alrighty, sorry about that. I got interrupted briefly. This is Model Minority by Cory Doctorow. The American eagle was just crossing interstate. I can't enunciate today. The American eagle was just crossing Interstate 278 when he heard the sharp crack of a baton rapping on a car window. Then the voice, loud, commanding, a cop voice, full of rage, north of I-278, the Mason-Dixon line that separated white Staten Island from black Staten Island. Open a fucking window! Even with his superhuman hearing, he couldn't tell exactly where the voice had come from, not until the rapping came again, 3 more nightstick bangs, then the sound of a car windshield shattering. He got a bead on the sound, tuned in to the sounds of the scuffle, and tilted his body toward it, spilling altitude and cutting a swath through the drizzle, which fantailed behind him in his turbulent wake. With his arms out before him, his cape crackling behind him, he was a blue and red missile arrowing down and toward the sound. The man on the ground was black. The 4 cops around him were white. The black man on the ground was slender, mid-30s, with close-cropped hair and a small, neat mustache. His car was as neat as the mustache, shining even on this damp gray day. An older car, but one that was well looked after. The man was on the ground, and above his smart little mustache, his face was bleeding. There were little cubes of safety glass embedded in it, but also a bruise on his high cheekbone the shape of the tip of a nightstick. The 4 cops around the black man on the ground had their nightsticks out. They were hitting him. They'd be hitting him harder, but he'd been dragged out of his parked car and into the narrow space between it and the next car, and they were getting in each other's way. A baton landed on his head with a crack that the American eagle felt deep in the small alien bones of his inner ear. He winced and adjusted his angle to make a more direct, faster approach to the scene. The cars made the black man's body hard for the cops to reach with their batons, but his legs protruded into the parking lot where 2 of the cops could swing on him at once. They went at it like men driving in fence posts, big overhand swings that were aimed for the bones, the joints. The man on the ground moaned and cried out, while the 4 officers shouted. They shouted, "Stop resisting!" And, every 2 or 3 blows, broke off from the beating to pan around with their body cams, catching each other shouting, "Stop resisting," as they swung and swung. The American eagle swooped over their heads close enough that his tailwind pulled their hats askew, while he caught 2 of the batons in his 2 hands, yanking them clear so forcefully that one of the cops fell on his face. The other one caught his balance just as the American eagle settled to the ground. None of the cops were hitting the black man anymore. They were looking at him, all of them, even the black man, who had blood streaming out of his nose and a scalp wound. "What?" the cop who had hit the man in the head said. "Motherfucker had drugs on the center console, in plain sight, wouldn't open his window, obstructing government administration." The American eagle peered inside the cop, saw his blood pressure, took the measure of his pulse. The man's eye twitched, his gaze roved over the American eagle, then his baton twitched, all too fast for a human eye to follow. The American eagle didn't say a word, watched in silence. He was hovering, soles of his boots just a few inches off the wet parking lot pavement. It was intimidating to face down someone who could hover. The cop wilted. "Cuff him," he said. Hey, officers, the cuffs on my ankles, they're too tight, the black man said. I can't feel my left foot. Something's wrong. He had no cuffs on his ankles, but his left foot and ankle were visibly broken, bent at a sickening angle by multiple blows but from the two batons. The cop who'd said, "Cuff him," radioed for an ambulance. The black man said, "Did anyone get a video of this? I'm going to sue you all the way to hell." The cuff him cop, a sergeant named Tag Bianchi, a roided out little man with biceps that bulged around his vest and a neck too thick for his uniform collar, looked like he was going to kick the black man in the head. His foot actually twitched a little, but you'd need the American Eagle's alien perceptual apparatus to see it. But he restrained himself and boarded the ambulance with the black man when the EMTs rolled up. He'd got a bit of safety glass in the face when he'd smashed in the windshield, and it had given him an infinitesimal cut on one cheek. The EMTs gave him a very thorough checkup and put a dressing on it. The other cops looked around sheepishly once Bianchi and the ambulance had departed. There was an administrative task that fell to them now, gathering evidence, taking photos, impounding the vehicle. Compared to the beating that had been underway when the American Eagle arrived on the scene, it was dry and bureaucratic, for all that they were photographing blood spatters and making serious notes about the drugs they'd found on the black man's center console. "What's a center console?" the American Eagle asked, eavesdropping on a whispered conversation from 20 feet away. The two cops who'd been chatting looked even more embarrassed. That's the console," one said. He pointed at the armrest that separated the driver's seat from the passenger seat. "He had drugs in plain sight there?" "In a bag." The cop held up a large bag of weed. "But it's got a curved top. Anything you put on there would fall off." "Maybe it was the passenger seat." The cop's partner said, "No, center console. I saw it." The American Eagle stared at him. He was hovering again. "Listen." It was the other cop, the one who'd been talking to the tow driver on the phone. "Listen, Eagle, about Jeff, Bianchi, he's not a bad guy. He's good. His dad was career NYPD. He volunteers with the Little League." "Guy was a literal Eagle Scout," Center Console said. "Literally." They both looked pointedly at the American Eagle's emblem. "Which hospital are they going to?" the American Eagle asked. They told him, after a sullen pause. He took off, and his superhearing caught "not a bad guy" tell center console that only a fag or a pervert would run around in tights. It was disgusting. He touched down in the ambulance bay and found the EMTs who'd worked on the black man sipping coffees and waiting for a call-out. They watched his approach warily. That wasn't normal. Most people had grown up on the American Eagle. The comics, the newsreels, the radio dramas, the cartoons, the toys, the novelizations, the interviews, the educational films, the stage show, the musical, the movies, the reboots, the theme park rides. Even criminals who were going to end up in prison because the American Eagle had just showed up tended to get a little starstruck even as they were cursing their bad luck. "Hi, guys," he said. "Yo!" The EMT was white, jacked, tall, with short hair and really, really good athletic shoes. "About that guy you just brought in, the one the cops worked over, with the leg?" "Yeah?" "I want to make sure everything's okay with him. Could you tell me if he got checked in and triaged okay? Do you have his name? It was pretty bad back there, and I wanted to check in with him, let him know he's got legal options." "You a lawyer or a superhero?" The American Eagle had testified in literally hundreds of criminal trials, not to mention a couple genocide trials in The Hague. He had more than a century of practical legal experience, knew more than half the faculty at Yale. He also knew that this guy wasn't idly curious about his professional credentials. So do you have his name? The EMT drank some coffee. Hospital policy, HIPAA, HIPAA. Can't give it out. Sorry, Eagle. He spread his hands. It was okay, because the American Eagle had already read the name off a smudgy carbon in the shadows of the ambulance's interior. Wilbur Robinson, who'd had strong vitals when he was passed off from the EMT to the triage nurse. The Eagle also read Sergeant Joffrey. It's Gioffre. I'm assuming that's Joffrey or Jeffrey. Bianchi's paperwork, which was next to Robinson's. He also had good vitals, and a small facial cut described as superficial. Thanks for your help anyway. I'll just go ask the ER desk. He headed for the swinging doors, but the EMT stopped him. Staff only, that door. Front entrance, please. With a wicked little barb in its tail. The American Eagle drew stares when he entered the hospital, of course, and he felt bad that he was disrupting the work of the nurses and doctors. But he also got intense looks from the two uniformed cops who flanked the reception desk. Glares, really. One of them swore under his breath, loud enough for the Eagle to hear, but too quiet for anyone else to hear. The American Eagle memorized his badge number in an eye blink. I'm here to check in on a patient, he told the receptionist, who was legit starstruck and smiling like crazy. Wow, she said. He came in an ambulance, Wilbur Robinson. She started typing. The cop who'd cursed him said, Wait a sec. He loomed over the ER receptionist. That patient is a criminal suspect. No information to be released without permission from NYPD. The American Eagle frosted him. It wasn't a look he was often photographed with, but there were plenty of criminals who'd wilted under that glare. You are not a hospital official, officer. I'm a law enforcement officer, he said, and tapped his badge. I'm a deputized federal marshal, as it happens, the American Eagle said. What is the patient's status, please? The receptionist resumed typing. She looked at her screen, at the Eagle, at the cop. I'll page the supervising physician to brief you, she said, which was a smart way of getting off the hook without being a dick to a bona fide superhero. Working in an ER had taught her some fast-footed diplomacy. Thank you, the American Eagle said. The cop glared at both of them. The doc was Asian, and her surname, Faruqi, made the American Eagle guess that her parents were Pakistani. The cop started talking before he could say a word. Your patient has been placed under arrest by the New York Police Department, and he is not allowed to have any visitors. I didn't ask to see him. I asked to speak to his doctor. The cop squared up to him, which was brave and stupid, since the American Eagle could have literally punched him so hard that he'd put his fist through his chest, body armor and all. There'd been an early boxing class in any town where he'd turned the gym's punching bag into a ripped tatter with an embarrassing explosion of sand all over the floor. It hadn't been easy to be an 8-year-old extraterrestrial with a secret identity in Anytown, Ohio. The cop was about to say something, but the doctor broke in. She had an ER doctor's knack of literally not being surprised by anything. A cop arguing with a superhero is only interesting if you have slept in the past 36 hours, and if you haven't been called upon to improvise a means of removing an odd-shaped foreign object from an embarrassing orifice. I'm Dr. Faruqi. Small, neat, baggy-eyed, short, glossy black hair, skin paler than any Pakistani the American Eagle had ever met, someone who spent a lot of time indoors. I can confirm that NYPD policies are not relevant to my capacity to discuss or withhold information about the status of a patient. She gave the cop a dead-eyed look that gave exactly 0 fucks. The Eagle liked her. The relevant rules are to be found in the HIPAA and the rules of this hospital, both of which say that I may not communicate his condition with a federal marshal unless there is a court order or a compelling immediate law enforcement need, or unless he consents. Mr. Eagle, do you happen to have a court order? The American Eagle shook his head. The cop looked smug. I see. And I can see no compelling law enforcement need. Is that right? The eagle nodded. Thank you. I will now ask my patient if he consents to my sharing his details with you. The cop jolted. Wait! But the doctor was already gone. The cop looked like he wanted to chase her down and tackle her, but the American eagle wouldn't let that happen. When the doc came back, she said, Come with me, please, to the American eagle and led him down the hallway. The cop took 2 steps after him, and the doctor turned and said, Please, wait there. The doc led the eagle into a consulting room and closed the door. Mr. Robinson has suffered extensive injuries to his left leg that will require multiple surgeries and years of therapy to address, and he may never walk without discomfort again. He is mildly concussed and has a fracture to the orbit of his left eye. Thankfully, no bone fragments were driven into his eye. His nose is broken, and he has lost 2 teeth. All of the fingers on his right hand are broken and have been put in a cast. He has 1 broken rib and less serious contusions and abrasions across much of his body. The American eagle had seen a lot of man's inhumanity to man in various war zones across the decades, and even had to clean up after one of the good guys had lost his shit and did something not so good. But this affected him differently. This hadn't happened on a battlefield in the fog of war. This had happened in a little private parking lot in Staten Island in broad daylight, committed by a group of guys who could have stopped each other, but instead shouted, Stop resisting! For the benefit of one another's body cams. He unbunched his fists, and the doctor relaxed a little. He didn't mean to scare the doc, who'd done him a solid. Can you take him a message? The doc nodded. I'll testify on his behalf. The doc nodded again. Is that all? Yes. No. Wait. Tell him it was wrong, and I'll testify on his behalf. All right. He left by another exit, coming out in the ambulance bay without passing the cop again. He did a vertical takeoff and used his X-ray vision to watch the elevator ascend with the doc, then followed the doc's progress through the corridors of the 7th floor until she went into Wilbur Robinson's room. The eagle noted the room and then flew up into the clouds to get away from the prying eyes of the people in the parking lot, who were staring up and pointing at him. The late winter sun set early, and he came back down out of the clouds and hovered above the hospital's west wing, scanning Wilbur Robinson's room before landing on the roof and using his cold breath to freeze the lock mechanism on the roof door, then twiddling the latch with a thin piece of metal so that it clicked open. Once inside, he warmed it up again with his heat vision and ensured that the latch clicked back into place. He leapt over the stair railing and slowly floated down to the 7th floor, avoiding the CCTVs trained on the stairs themselves. Once on 7, he blurred too quickly for the human eye to follow down to Wilbur Robinson's room, snatching a handful of pens out of a nursing station pot on the way. He scattered these in front of the NYPD officer standing outside Robinson's room, executed a fast turn that sent a sudden gust of wind down the corridor, and as the cop bent down to look at the pens in bewilderment, he blurred back down the hall and past him, in to Robinson's room. Robinson looked at him out of one eye and smiled a sardonic, bruised smile. You, huh? Did the doctor give you my message? The eagle said, taking in the weird twists of Robinson's neat little mustache, now humped over his swollen lips like a stepped-on, rainy-day sidewalk worm. Robinson nodded. Very nice of you. Thank you. It's not right. There was a hitch in the eagle's voice. No, but it's not unusual either. Why me, Mr. Eagle? The American eagle knew what he meant. He watched the news, read Twitter. He'd seen the camera phone videos. Gotta start somewhere. Can I make a prediction, with no offense intended? The American eagle nodded. Of course. Right now, you are white. That's a okay, this is important. I'm going to take this from the top. This is like one of the most significant. This is a biggie. Right now, you are white, but that's a wholly contingent proposition. I mean, no offense, but you aren't a white man because you aren't a human. You aren't even a man, are you? This was not new territory for the Eagle. Supervillains often taunted him with cruel speculation about his gender identity and species. But whether or not he was white had never really been a part of it. It jolted him twice. First, when he realized that he'd never thought about it, and again, jolt, it really seemed weird that it never came up. I'm not really a man, I suppose, not in the sense of being terrestrial or human. You're also not white. You ever hear those heritage not hate types, that myth that the Irish were the first slaves in America? They're an interesting bunch. They're so close, so close to understanding that whiteness is a thing that other people choose for you. People are white if whiteness is endowed upon them by the wider whiteness. It starts before birth and carries on after you're dead. And what whiteness gives, it can take away. You don't understand that, I bet, but you are only white by courtesy, Mr. Eagle, and you are really only a little green man clothed in whiteness. You won't believe how quickly you can be de-whitened. You're the original illegal alien. Mr. Robinson, what happened to you is inexcusable. I'll do whatever it takes to help you get justice. Wilbur Robinson snorted, then winced. I have to be honest, Mr. American Eagle. I have a feeling that if you try that, you'll get us both in a lot of trouble. The American Eagle used his heat vision to melt the seal around the window, carefully lifted it out, then melted the seal back into place while hovering outside the 7th floor. Then he flew home and made himself some dinner. The American Eagle didn't need to sleep much. 4 hours a night was plenty, and in a pinch he could go 5 or 6 days without sleeping. His planet of origin had a much longer diurnal cycle than Earth. He was used to flying patrols in those long hours, but tonight he sat in, laptop open, VPN'd into an anonymizer in the British Virgin Islands that was favored by extremely successful financial crooks and thus probably pretty good against U.S. law enforcement and espionage agencies. He read what the message boards and social media were saying about him. This was never a good idea, and yet he was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Soon he'd opened dozens of tabs, and he'd reload them all and shoot through the line, looking for new messages. No one was impressed with him. The Blue Lives Matter crowd were saying that he'd sold out and taken the side of thugs over law enforcement. Anti-racist activists said that no amount of token gestures could undo his generations' worth of assistance in the causes of white supremacy and American empire. Even the people who were sympathetic to him thought that he was being naive, believing that he could solve racism by beating it up. He was powerfully tempted to leap into the fray and anonymously defend himself, but he tamed the urge. He had spent more than a century keeping his identity secret from the increasingly sophisticated intelligence apparatus of the U.S. government and its adversaries and allies, and in the age of mass surveillance, he was keenly aware that there were lots of ways to draw an arrow pointed at his secret identity and a line connecting it to the American Eagle. He kept on reloading, treasuring the people who took up his cause, even as he recognized their arguments weren't very good. They mostly summed up to, but he's a superhero. It was dawn, and when he saw the post showing Wilbur Robinson being moved by ambulance to the tombs. Okay. I don't know how to read. Sorry. This happens from time to time. It's happening more frequently lately. I'm not sure why. Degenerative brain sickness? Who knows? It was dawn when he saw the post showing Wilbur Robinson being moved by ambulance to the tombs. He hit the buttons that powered off all his devices and sprinted 2 miles, dodging the CCTVs before taking to the sky. He never took off from the same location twice, and he had a randomizing program that directed him to the day's launch point, avoiding any kind of constant distance from his hideout. He ascended out of the troposphere and broke the sound barrier with a crack that made the clouds behind him ripple. He was over Staten Island 5 minutes later, tracing the route the police ambulance would have taken to get to the tombs. He caught up with it a block from the jailhouse and touched down noiselessly on the roof, training his super hearing on the transfer as the wheelchair was maneuvered down the ambulance's ramp and into the jail. Bianchi was pushing, and the eagle heard him cursing softly under his breath in a steady monotone, a recital of all the ways in which Wilbur Robinson was to be made to pay for his transgressions. The monotone stopped when a sheriff's deputy stepped out to meet them and take over pushing the chair. Wilbur Robinson's face was a blank mask, either bravely stoic or too terrified to speak. The American eagle felt that spike again, that sense of urgency and wrongness. He used his X-ray vision to track the wheelchair's progress into the jail's intake, watched as Bianchi stepped into some kind of break room and got himself a coffee, then flicked his attention back to Wilbur Robinson just as he went sprawling on the floor. Without a conscious thought, the American eagle leapt down to the entrance and pulled the door open so hard its lock went flying off with a noise like a rifle shot. In an instant he was standing over Wilbur Robinson, who was face down on the floor, still stoic, leg and cast stuck out behind him at a twisted, awkward angle. The guard who'd just tripped him onto the floor was skinny, young, and white, and red-faced with fury, which was quickly turning into shock. "What are you doing?" the eagle bellowed, thinking, dumb question. The guard gawped twice, then found his words. "Prisoners have to be searched. It's a safety policy. This prisoner was non-compliant." "I wouldn't stand up," Wilbur Robinson said mildly from the floor. He patted the large cast on his left leg meaningfully. "He has a broken leg," the American eagle said. "The prisoner was non-compliant," the guard swallowed. "You are not authorized to be here. Please leave." "See," Wilbur Robinson said, "from 'Can I get a selfie to show the kids' to 'Please leave' in minutes. Watch out, Eagle. Non-whiteness is catching. It's all downhill from here." The American eagle stared at the guard. The guard wilted. "You can search him with me present," the eagle said. The guard looked like he was going to go for help, but then he pursed his lips, shook his head, and knelt by Wilbur Robinson and searched him. "I was in a hospital," Robinson said as the guard felt him up. "I'm wearing a hospital gown. Where do you think I'm hiding my contraband?" As if to answer, the guard drew out a small flashlight and put it between his teeth. It was dented with many small tooth marks, and lifted up Robinson's ground. The eagle pulled the gown down so fast the breeze ruffled the guard's short hair. "That won't be necessary. Mr. Robinson is not violent." "It's procedure," he said around his flashlight. The eagle thought about the likely problems arising from holding a tool used in cavity searches in your mouth, and revised his opinion of the guard's intelligence even lower. "It's not necessary," the American eagle said, and stood the guard up. "Let's get Mr. Robinson transferred to the jail hospital, shall we?" Another staring match. The eagle was good at these. His species didn't use gazes the way humans did, after all, so he could stare in ways that were arbitrarily unsettling. Nictitating membranes helped. The eagle won. The guard knelt to drag Robinson into the wheelchair. The American eagle took Robinson up like an infant and placed him gently in the chair, then walked with the guard all the way through the jail's many internal turns and twists. Prisoners and guards alike stared after them, and the eagle listened in on their whispered conversations, because anyone who whispers around an alien with legendarily superhuman hearing has no reasonable expectation of privacy. It's not like they were saying anything interesting. He saw Robinson through a medical intake exam, stepping out of the room for part of it to give him privacy while he was nude, using his super hearing to figure out when to go back in. He waited until Robinson was settled into a hospital bed, and then he said goodbye to Robinson, who told him not to worry, that he'd be back. Robinson rolled his eyes. The American Eagle made sure he ran into Bianchi on his way out of the jail. Bianchi jerked to one side when he saw the Eagle, like he was ducking a punch. He looked terrible, bags under his eyes, unshaved, rumpled. "Why is Robinson being held?" Bianchi pretended like he hadn't heard, so the Eagle took another step toward him. Another flinch, and Bianchi pulled himself together. "Why is Robinson being held?" Bianchi tried to shoulder past the Eagle, who moved to block him. "You're not leaving until you tell me why he's being held." Technically, this was obstruction, but the Eagle was a federal marshal, and this guy was a local screw. He had rank. Bianchi glared at him. The Eagle shrugged. "He's being held for obstructing government administration, unlawful possession of marijuana, assault in the second degree, assault in the third degree, blocking pedestrian traffic, and loitering." The American Eagle had once flown into the heart of the Earth's sun, where light that was born 50,000 years ago began its slow fight against the immense gravities to reach the star's surface and radiate to the Earth. What he saw there was a wonder and marvel of the natural world, and it left him wordless. It was less surprising than the list of charges against Robinson. When the American Eagle busted someone, he did so for a good reason. "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" "Get the fuck out of my way before I arrest you." "I'd like to see you try." He realized that right from the start, that was what he wanted to see this guy try. The American Eagle had spent his whole life, centuries of it, daring bullies to pick on someone your own size, which was always bullshit since no Homo sapiens ever born was an even match for the American Eagle. But it was immensely satisfying to see the expression on a bully's face when he came to grips with the fact that they were in the presence of an immovable object that was also an unstoppable force. Eventually, the authorities or the army would show up and take the bully away, and the Eagle would leap into the sky and return to his hideout, safe in the knowledge that he'd done his bit for the human race he'd adopted as his own. This time, there'd be no authorities to take the bully away. He couldn't block Bianchi until the Internal Affairs Squad showed up and stripped him of his badge, gun, and honor. That may never happen. The only way this standoff could end is with the American Eagle backing down. So he did. Bianchi scowled and pushed past him, and the American Eagle leapt into the sky and returned to his hideout. At the bail hearing, Bruce sought him out. "Can I have a word with you?" the billionaire playboy said. The courtroom was nearly empty, of course, but everyone there stared at them. The judge had ordered the courtroom cleared and sealed a moment before, and so it was just the public defender, Wilbur Robinson, the prosecutor, Bianchi, and a police union lawyer, the three other cops from the beating, the court clerk, the court reporter, and four bailiffs who'd taken up nervous stations around the Eagle, silently asking each other how the exact fuck they were going to remove the American, for Christ's sakes, Eagle if he didn't want to go. Everyone was pleased to see Bruce. Billionaire playboys made New York City go. There'd been a certain amount of palling. There'd been a certain amount of palling around between him and the Eagle over the years, public ribbon cuttings and the like. They didn't know about Bruce's secret identity. Secret! And couldn't know that he and the Eagle had fought alongside one another on several occasions, were veterans of the same long war on crime and supervillainy. "Your Honor, do you suppose I could have a moment with my friend?" Bruce was smooth as a carbon nanotube smoothie. The judge, whose pet cause, an animal sanctuary on Long Island Sound, depended on Bruce's annual check to keep its lights burning, favored the billionaire with one of his most indulgent smiles and banged his gavel. The eagle and Bruce kept their eyes locked on one another as everyone filed out of the room. Once the door closed, the American eagle touched down, and Bruce slouched into one of the lawyer's chairs behind the defendant's table. "This has got to stop." Voice of command, a man used to having his orders obeyed. At least he didn't use his tough guy gravel voice. That voice, so affected. "I agree," the eagle said. "This stops now, in fact." Bruce rolled his eyes. "Come on, Eagle. Complicated problems have complicated solutions. You can't punch racism until it sees the error of its ways." "I'm not planning on ending racism in general, but I am dedicated to ensuring that Wilbur Robinson gets a fair trial." Bruce got a shrewd look. "How does Robinson feel about this?" The American eagle squirmed. Bruce was good at getting to the heart of the matter. "I get the impression he thinks I... Oh, sorry. I get the impression he thinks I'm a naive idiot." Bruce snorted. "And maybe I am, but he's also pointed out that I'm no more of a white man than he is. But I get to be a pretend white guy, and that means I get to do things he can't do without being killed. Now I'm going to use that. It starts with Wilbur Robinson, and I'm not sure where it ends." Bruce opened his mouth, but the American eagle was, naturally, faster, and he jumped in. "You, Bruce, you have a lot of that privilege, too. You use that privilege to—" He dropped his voice, mindful of the court reporter's recorder, pitching his whisper for Bruce's ears alone. "Dress up in a costume and beat up supervillains." He brought his voice back up to normal volume. "Have you ever considered that all the while there are guys in uniforms who are, as a body, every bit as much of a supervillain as the evilest terrorist whose plans you've foiled? People who, as a group, cause as much misery as anyone on the public enemy list?" Bruce looked exasperated. "Now we're back to punching racism into submission." "I'm not going to punch anyone or anything, Bruce. I'm just going to make sure that one guy gets a fair trial. One innocent guy, Bruce." "And then what?" The American eagle shrugged. "And then I'll do it again. Lather, rinse, repeat. I got a lot of time, Bruce. Hundreds of years. Think of me like a random audit. The IRS doesn't have to check everyone's tax returns, just pull enough at random that everyone else colors inside the lines." "What if someone kills your innocent guy because you got him off?" Bruce was getting angry. The American eagle could tell by the infrared signatures of the veins around his temples. "Are you listening to yourself? You think the IRS keeps people honest? Man, I'm a billionaire. You think the thing that keeps me filing my taxes is fear of the IRS? I can afford more lawyers than them. Better lawyers. More better lawyers. I pay exactly as much in taxes as I deign to. The IRS doesn't have any power, Eagle, but I'll tell you who does. The NSA. You think you have a secret identity? You think your little countermeasures and OPSEC has kept them from tracing your identity? It hasn't." He leaned into the eagle, pulled him down so he could whisper a name in his ear. If the eagle had come from a species that paled when upset, he would have gone ashen. "Yeah, Eagle, that's right. Think about that. Think about what else they know. Who else they know. They've been assuming you need to keep your identity secret to protect your loved ones from criminals and foreign spies. Once you have to keep that stuff secret from your own government, your threat model totally changes. And the right time to address that threat is about 50 years ago. Don't make me draw you a picture." He didn't need a picture. The American eagle could imagine Lois knocked on the floor of some jailhouse by some sadistic prick of a cop, subjected to the kind of search he'd stopped. He could guard her, sure, maybe even sneak her off to the high desert, but A, she wouldn't stand for it, and B, then he wouldn't be able to keep an eye on Wilbur Robinson. He was briefly and powerfully furious. How could the most powerful being on Earth be so easy to outfox? But of course, he knew the answer.
because he had allowed himself to care about humans. That was the source of all his problems. He could have spent 10,000 years in the heart of the sun, but no, he'd return to Earth to interpose himself in the affairs of the intelligent life of that planet, which was not his own and never had been. He mastered his emotions and thought. You wouldn't let that happen, Bruce. You think I could stop the NSA? The American Eagle stared at him. Bruce was one of the richest men who'd ever lived, a contractor on both the white and black sides of the Pentagon's budget, with clearances to match the Joint Chiefs. He owned his own covert armory and an overt armory, and corporations he had made majority stakes in provided intelligence contracting to the entire roster of federal espionage and policing agencies, not to mention most major metros' police forces. Blech. He almost certainly got a paycheck every time the cops in Staten Island were advised by a machine learning algorithm to go to the brown side of the Mason-Dixon line and start making black people turn out their pockets and drop their pants. Bruce looked away first. Something about staring into those alien eyes, it bested even the toughest terrestrial organisms. The American eagle had once stared down a whale. I'll do what I can, he swallowed. Listen, I love you. Your cause is a good one, but you can't win this. You have to understand that. You can't just stand between that poor bastard and what the system is going to do to him. I believe that's exactly what I'm doing. I'll hire him a lawyer. He's already lost his job with the city. Once he gets off, I'll hire him and give him a better job. I'm glad to hear it. You've got to stop this before it goes too far. His face twisted up. Look, you know that I know people. I've heard them talking about this. No one likes the idea of an extraterrestrial declaring war on the U.S. government. That is not a good look, Eagle. Right now you are white, but that's a wholly contingent proposition. It struck the American Eagle that Bruce had been calling him Eagle, but hadn't mentioned the American part lately. Bruce used to jokingly call him things like Yankee Doodle and USA Today, but today it was just Eagle, which meant something, probably. I'm just fighting for the same things I always fought for. Bruce grinned wryly. Truth, justice, and the American way? Equal protection under the law, the right of persons to be secure against unreasonable search and seizures. Cruel and unusual punishments shall not be inflicted. Okay, yeah, Con Law 101. But Eagle, have you really always fought for this? I know it was before my time, but I never heard about you getting between Bull Connor's dogs and the NAACP. Bruce had an uncanny knack for finding the places the American Eagle didn't want him to go. But the Eagle lifted his chin. That's because I wasn't there, but I should have been. And now I'm here. What will you tell your grandkids when they ask you where you were today? I'll tell them that I tried to talk a friend out of destroying his life in a useless bid to assuage his white guilt. The Eagle looked around the empty courtroom. A wholly contingent proposition. Then I guess we're done here. Bruce looked at him long enough that the Eagle felt a rare urge to look away first. Then Bruce left the courtroom, and a moment later everyone else filed back in. The judge and the bailiffs carried on as if he wasn't there. They had apparently decided to treat him as part of the furniture, like the elaborate eagle motif on some finial. He listened to the reading of the charges and kept his face impassive through each absurdity. It seemed like the least he could do, given how stoic Wilbur Robinson was being. Bianchi was dressed in a suit that strained around his softball-sized biceps, and his tie knot was visibly digging into his bull neck. Clearly, this was a guy who gave more thought to his weight training than his tailoring. The American Eagle caught Bianchi's eye, and Bianchi smirked at him. "Bail is set at $500,000, the judge said. The American Eagle contained a gasp and saw Wilbur Robinson's face tighten. The Eagle knew that this astronomical sum was the result of his own actions. He realized that he should have asked Bruce to post bail. He still could. The public defender made a half-hearted objection, got gavelled back into his seat, and then the bailiff started to lead Wilbur Robinson away. The eagle followed them. They pretended they didn't see him for a while, and then one of them turned around and drew himself up and said, "Sir, will you please step away? We have a job to do here." "So do I," the eagle said, but he let them go. Robinson, who had been acting as if he wasn't there, turned around and looked at him one last time. The Eagle called several of his State Department contacts that night, hoping one of them would find a channel to the prosecutors on Robinson's case. It pained him to do it because he wanted the system to just be right, not to make an exception. It made him admit that rather than intervening during the beating, or at the hospital, or at the jail, or at the bail hearing, he could have pulled a string or two. He was the American fucking Eagle, and there were plenty of people who owed him a favor or two. But as he quickly discovered, any debts the American people and their government officials owed him could be easily wiped clean. All that had to happen was for him to publicly declare himself to be a foe of the American system. He hadn't realized that that was what he'd been doing, but it was painfully clear that there was no way to separate the American system from whether a foursome of Staten Island cops should be allowed to beat the shit out of Wilbur Robinson, lie about it, and then send him to jail. His phone rang. Lois. "Hi, darling." "Still up, I see. I saw you tweeting about your train set, and I said to myself, Lois, that fool of a man is up past his bedtime again and needs a talking to." He laughed. He did indeed have a model train set, a really elaborate one, and his secret identity was a member of all kinds of little forums and circles of other modelers, posting tilt-shift photos of their tables and the tiny, German-manufactured figurines. He genuinely enjoyed the hobby and was able to paint his miniatures with an accuracy that was, of course, literally superhuman. Tweeting pictures of his minis was one of his pleasures, even if it did complicate his OPSEC. He had a randomizer that queued up tweets to go out during waking hours in New York, so that there were no suspicious gaps in the pattern that coincided with known American Eagle overseas missions. Lois had grown accustomed to his strange work-related absences, and sometimes Twitter stalked him to figure out when he was up and available, which sometimes meant that she tried to call him while he was defusing a rogue nuke or scooping a missile out of the sky before it could hit a refugee camp and flying it into the stratosphere to detonate harmlessly. "How was your day, darling?" Uh, Good, I guess. Another day of trying to second source anonymous tips. Another dollar." "Poor baby." He crossed to his sofa and stretched out on his back, arm flung over his eyes, picturing Lois, remembering the smell of her hair and the feel of her skin. "I miss you." "I miss you too. Date night tomorrow." He'd forgotten. "I remembered." "Like hell. That's okay, because I remembered, and I got us a table at the Big Carrot." The American Eagle had trouble digesting most terrestrial food, but the lower on the food chain, the easier it was for him to metabolize. The invention of veganism had been an enormous boon to him, and the raw food fad had been a godsend for his guts. "You're a champ." "I am. You pick the cocktail bar for drinks first, somewhere around Flatbush or even Park Slope. Anywhere with a hipster in a leather apron who makes their own bitters, please." "Sold." Lois loved craft cocktails, and he loved being with Lois. "Now, why the hell are you up so late, fella?" "Work," he said, which should have ended the discussion. He and Lois had an understanding that he couldn't talk about his job. This ban drove her reporter's nosiness nuts, but she also had a reporter's circumspection and understood that she couldn't be forced to disclose things she didn't know. I am having a really hard time with this paragraph. Let's take it from the top. My bad, folks. He and Lois had an understanding that he couldn't talk about his job. This ban drove her reporter's nosiness nuts, but she also had a reporter's circumspection and understood that she couldn't be forced to disclose things she didn't know, and that two may keep it a secret and that two may keep a secret only if one of them is dead. It was an odd but enduringly sound basis for a lasting relationship between a professional nosy person and a professional haver of secrets, and the American Eagle suspected that she may have figured it out on her own anyway. There were a few memorable celebratory joint press conferences with the governor in which he'd run into her while dressed in his eagle suit, and she'd been awfully familiar and knowing. "You can't let it get to you, Clark. Let other people shoulder some of the load. It's not up to you to do everything." It was stuff like this that made him think she'd figured it out, but he wasn't going to admit anything, especially not on an insecure phone line. "You're right, of course, but it's easier said than done. Look, so long as you're up and farting around with your trains, why don't you come over here? I've got a filing deadline for O Dark 100, so I'm likely to be up for hours yet, and I could use the company. You can make coffee and rub my shoulders." He could be there in less than 10 minutes, even figuring in his randomized sprints to get a non-repeating takeoff spot. "I'll see you in an hour." "Good boy. Bring donuts." He feigned sleep on her sofa until she was ready to go to bed, then let her wake him up and spent a few hours actually dozing, with his arm around her shoulders, his face buried in her hair. He'd had other human mates, watched them grow old, become ancient, die. He'd revealed himself to some of them, but he'd just left the others behind, faking his death, sometimes with the help of a friend or two in government. The American Eagle got to call in a lot of favors. He always went to their funerals, which was a huge OPSEC lapse that could have connected his identities, but it was also the right thing to do. Watching Lois filled him with indescribable emotions. The sadness of being the last of his kind. A different sadness in knowing that his connection with Lois would end with her withering away while he lived on. A fierce protective feeling about her that he thought of as love, but which he knew might not match up with what Lois and others meant when they thought of that emotion. He slipped out of the bedroom and tuned his hearing to the FM band, concentrating until he dialed in NPR. Increasingly, this was how he got his news. Analog radio reception didn't leave any digital trail that could be connected to him, unlike, say, a set-top cable box that might capture his interest whenever stories about the American Eagle were featured on a news channel. Someday the radio would go all digital, and he'd either have to learn to demodulate them in his head, like doing a million simple math puzzles but all at once and every second, or he'd have to armor his news consumption with online anonymity tools. The news was the usual mix of geopolitical chaos, domestic strife, and promos for podcasts of artfully told personal memoirs. Lois always listened with a professional ear, providing back-of-house gossip about the other reporters, the personalities they interviewed. Despite his long life, the American Eagle didn't have her perspective, so what he heard just filled him with a kind of melancholy. Hadn't there been a time when things were better? Now they were talking about him. A criminologist at NYU, a West Point war historian, and a national cop reporter on a panel show. "The rule of law, not the rule of men. It's always the risk when you let someone operate outside of the normal legal framework that he'll become a vigilante rather than a volunteer. In this case, he's not even human, so who can say what he's thinking, where his allegiances lie? We know he's got a much longer lifespan than we do. Perhaps this is just a kind of teenage rebellion." The host broke in. "Leaving aside sorry. Leaving aside xenobiological speculation, can we return to the question, what should New York do? Should a grand jury be impaneled to indict a beloved national figure? Should the mayor ask him to come around to his office for a quiet one-on-one? Do we all sign a petition telling him to butt out?" The war historian. "Long experience shows that there's always a no-appeasement crowd during these conflicts, but the peace is always attained through some kind of reconciliation. We don't have the facilities to imprison the American Eagle, notwithstanding rumors of rare metals that can debilitate him. We are going to have to make peace with him, eventually. Also, I remind you that he doesn't have to be the American Eagle. There's no law or force of nature that could prevent him from being the Saudi Eagle, or the Chinese Eagle, or the ISIS Eagle." The cop reporter made a rude noise. Come on, the guy is taking a stand because he opposes police brutality. You think he's going to join ISIS? The host called time on the debate, saying they'd have to leave it there for now, and the American Eagle tuned out the radio energy. What he really wanted was news about Robinson, but no one was reporting on Robinson, and everyone was reporting on him. He heard Lois stir in the next room, put on a robe, pad out to him. He held still, pretending he hadn't heard, so she could walk up behind him and tap his shoulder, and he could pretend to be startled. This always pleased her, and it let him keep up the human pretense. She made them both coffees and gave him his black, with a kiss on the cheek. It smelled great. Lots of human food smelled better than it tasted. He sipped it, though, and made himself smile and smack his lips. Can't sleep, fella? She blew on her coffee. He realized he probably should have done the same. By human standards, it was very hot coffee. Lois may have been testing him. He'd been married to a woman who did that a century before. He liked 'em smart. Getting old, I guess. They say a good night's sleep is the first thing you lose. Then your hair. He grabbed his own wavy hair and tugged at it, mugging. You've got a few good years left in you. You've got a few good years left in you yet. She touched his hand, cupped his chin, looked into his eyes. You want to talk about it? He looked away. Yeah, all right. But let me tell you about my troubles then. Maybe that'll put your puny worries into perspective. He chuckled. Shoot. My editor has assigned me to write about Wilbur Robinson, but he really wants me to write about the American Eagle. The Eagle didn't bat an eyelash, though her eyes searched his face. That's all anyone wants to hear about, of course. There are hundreds of Wilbur Robinsons in New York every year, but there's only one extraterrestrial Superman who's threatening cops and judges. But you really want to write about Robinson? I really do. So interview him. I can't. He's smart enough not to talk to me without a lawyer, and he can't afford a lawyer, so he's not talking to me. You can't blame him. No, I can't. So, since he's not talking to me, and since I don't want to write about the American Eagle, I've decided to write about predictive policing instead. What's that? She smiled. Well, that's the thing. Predictive policing is why those cops beat the shit out of Wilbur Robinson. Companies are selling police forces software, artificial intelligence that crunches through all the arrest data to the beginning of time and makes predictions about where crime is going to be. The argument is that the math doesn't lie, and math isn't racist. Its recommendations are supposed to be empirical, neutral. Sounds like you don't believe that. No one with half a brain should believe it. All you have to do is think about it for 10 seconds. All the data they feed this system to predict crime comes from the cops, who are assumed to have some kind of bias. First, because they're human, and all humans have bias, and second, because NYPD has a long history of getting caught in racial discrimination, which is why they're buying this stuff in the first place. Because cops only find crime where they look for it. If you make every black person you see turn out their pockets, you will find every knife and every dime baggie that any black person carries. But that doesn't tell you anything about whether black people are especially prone to carrying knives or drugs, especially when cops make quota by carrying around a little something something to plant, if need be. What's more, we know that black people are more likely to be arrested for stuff that white people get a pass on, like blocking public sidewalks. White guys who stop outside their buildings to have a smoke or just think about their work days don't get told to move along or get ticketed or get searched. Black guys do. So any neighborhood with black guys in it will look like it's got an epidemic of sidewalk blocking, but it really has an epidemic of over-policing. But now you take all those tickets and busts and you turn them into data, which is treated as equivalent to crime statistics. If the data says that an address in front of a housing project has an epidemic of blocking public sidewalks, and the same address has an epidemic of drug possession, these are proof that this is a crime hotspot, not proof that every black guy who stops to wait for an Uber or chat with a neighbor gets stop and frisked, and then busted for a petty weed possession because as soon as he is ordered to empty his pockets, his joint is in plain sight, and the cops can ticket him for it. Tell the computer to take all the data at face value and then ask it to predict where the crime is going to be, and, no surprise, it will deduce with astounding machine insight that the cops will find weed if they ask everyone going in and out of that building to empty their pockets. Never mind that you'd find as much or more weed if you subjected everyone entering Trump Tower to the same treatment, because you don't have evidence of the drug problem at Trump Tower, because heads would roll if chatting with your Fifth Avenue doorman about the ball game got you ticketed and searched, and you have computer verified proof that there's a drug problem south of the Mason-Dixon line. That's why Wilbur Robinson got 6 kinds of shit beaten out of him. When a New York cop pulls someone over, they have to fill in a form, a UF 250, with the reason for the stop. It's got checkboxes on it, like inappropriate attire and furtive movement. And so long as a cop ticks one of those boxes, he's made a solid stop. But it's bullshittier than that. Cops have quotas, minimum numbers of these 250s that they have to turn in. And guess what? If you are a not too bright cop looking for somewhere to go and make your quota and keep your sergeant off your back, the predictive policing model will tell you where to go and look for furtive movements and inappropriate attire. And the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association has rigged things so that these half-bright cops are impossible to fire. They get to review the footage from their body cams before they turn in their reports. They get to know the identities of whistleblowers who complain about them. They get to decide who gets to interrogate them and for how long. Stuff no other perp gets. So psychos get to psycho, long after they've cost the city hundreds of thousands or even millions in settlements with the people they beat up. And they march out, armed with a computer prediction and a pad of 250s, and they start telling brown people to get out of their cars and put their hands up against the wall. That cop who led the beatdown, Bianchi, I found a dozen incidents like this in the news morgue. He's hiding in plain sight, a total psycho, but his disciplinary record is sealed, and so are the settlements he racked up for the city. He never should have been out on the job to begin with, but 250s and predictive policing made him a trouble-seeking missile. He was going to put someone brown in the hospital, and Wilbur Robinson just lost the lottery. Lois, she smiled self-deprecatingly. I know, I'm ranting. Thing is, if I write that, it lands on the editorial page as opinion. But it's fact. It's this true story of Jeffrey Bianchi and Wilbur Robinson. And you can't understand them without understanding all that. She gave him a very significant look. If I could explain one thing to the American Eagle, it would be that he should be hanging city officials by their ankles out of office windows until they explain how this fucked up, ridiculous situation came to pass on their watch. Then he can move on to the police union. Then the software developers. I understand how a guy like that can end up feeling like he's just tinkering in the margins of the problem and wants to draw a line in the sand, but drawing it in front of Wilbur Robinson is a no-win situation. The American Eagle considered her words carefully. I guess the American Eagle would say that if it's hard to get people to take you seriously when you're standing between one of their fellow citizens and an unjust system, it's a lot harder when you're beating confessions out of police officials. She gave him an even more pointed look. The American Eagle didn't squirm, but he wanted to. I guess the question is, does the American Eagle want to feel good about himself or make a difference? All right, because I love all of you, we're going to just read to the end of the story. Um, we're going to double our running time, but it'll be fine. That's right. I have love for all of you. Although using a non-terrestrial biology and values set, that may mean a different thing to me than it does to you. What evil lurks in the hearts of men? Only the shadow knows. Where are we? I just lost my page. This is smart.
I'm just so good. I'm just so good. I can't even help myself. I'm just so good.
There it is. Okay. Sorry about that. Ouch. Don't hit that. That hurts. The judge denied Wilbur Robinson's bail, and when people who'd read about his story, some thanks to Lois and her articles, raised money for a lawyer to appeal, he lost too. Someone leaked a story about the prosecutor's fury at the American Eagle's intervention to Lois, but she couldn't get a second source to confirm it, so she didn't publish it. It ended up on the front page of the Post instead. The American Eagle took the ferry to Rikers, smiling at people, taking selfies, signing autographs for kids. By the time he got to the guardhouse and asked to visit Wilbur Robinson, they were waiting for him. Warden, deputies, a PR guy, a couple of nervous-looking screws in SWAT gear. "Would you mind stepping into my office for a private conversation, sir?" The warden was young for the job, with a disarming smile and a couple of big scars showing under his brush cut from the IED that had blown apart his helmet when he was patrolling Kandahar province. The Eagle considered it. "I think I would just like to go through the normal visitation procedure, if it's all the same to you, Warden." They had an audience. Black women and their kids, mostly, visiting loved ones, getting ready for the humiliation of pat-downs or even strip searches. "Sir, I think it would be better if—" The Eagle knew that once he was in the warden's office, away from those cameras, it would turn to a bureaucratic morass, him having to wait and wait and wait while the appropriate officials were summoned to their phones to discuss his visit with him, and that they would leave plenty of time to think up excuses why he couldn't see Wilbur Robinson, or even to airlift Robinson to another facility. "Warden," he said, leaning in, "please let me see Mr. Robinson now. Let's not have a scene." The two guys in SWAT gear looked anxiously at one another. Everyone else in the room had gone silent, even the small children there to see their parents. The warden eyeballed him for a long time. There was a famous video of the American Eagle bunker busting an infamous dictator's pulled from a cluster of armored point-of-view cameras that a DoD PR flack had convinced him to wear. He'd started the run with a dozen cameras and finished with only one, the rest destroyed by shrapnel, bullets, flamethrowers, and shockwaves, as the Eagle had relentlessly pushed his way into the stronghold, batting aside guards, allowing the enemy fire to bounce off his alien skin, smashing down armored doors with his bare hands. Even though the cameras had been destroyed, they'd streamed to an armored hard drive on his belt, and that had uplinked to a nearby Army MRAP with a mobile video support studio in it, and not one frame had been missed. The final product was edited to include the 11 camera-killing shots, with the final frames prior to each camera's destruction in extreme slow-mo, stretching out as the camera's output fragmented and went dark. It was such a riveting piece of work that even the fiercest opponents of U.S. military adventurism had grudgingly admitted that making viewers flinch in empathy for a webcam was an impressive feat. The Eagle had borne the dictator out in a fireman's carry, the man's face turned away from the waiting exterior cameras except for one final shot of terror that the film had ended on, zooming out to show that the man had literally wet his pants on the journey from his private panic room to the surface. The American Eagle had been told that he could expect to testify at the dictator's war crimes trial, but 8 years on, he was still waiting to be summoned. At last, the warden spoke. "Someone sign this person in on the visitor's log." The Eagle didn't set off the metal detector. He'd stashed his keys and phone on the roof of a Jackson Heights office tower on his way to Rikers, but he submitted to a pat-down anyway. The CO who patted him down tried to stay calm, but his heart was racing and his hands trembled. They led him to a conference room with two bolted-down chairs on either side of a bolted-down steel table with a scratched surface. There were no cameras, not even the little pinhole kinds that humans couldn't see with their naked eyes. It was a room that was used for lawyer-client meetings. While the Eagle waited for Robinson to be brought out, he experimented with the table, tapping it, looking for its resonant points. By the time Robinson arrived, he had his spot picked. Robinson was wheeled in by a deputy with a sour expression. The deputy said nothing as he wheeled Robinson to the table, locked down the chair's brakes from behind, and left, ostentatiously locking the door behind him. The Eagle looked at Robinson. He was haggard and unshaven, and smelled of stale B.O. It wouldn't be easy to shower at Riker's while in a cast. Robinson stared back. The Eagle found his spot on the table and started to drub his thumb on it softly and rapidly, setting up a beehive hum that rattled off the stone walls. "While I'm doing this, most mics will not be able to capture our speech," he said, projecting his voice so that Robinson could hear it over the drone. "That's a cute trick. You have a lot of those." "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "You didn't hit me. You didn't hit me." Robinson shifted painfully in his seat. "I admit that I didn't think this through before I acted. What I saw, it made me furious." "How do you think I felt?" The Eagle shut up. He knew that the person with a real problem here was Wilbur Robinson, not the alien being whom the humans had called the American Eagle for more than a century. "Let me tell you a funny story. That cop that crippled me, Bianchi, first time I saw him I was 19 years old and he was on the SCU, the Street Crime Unit. That doesn't exist anymore, but they were pure hooligans. They had special T-shirts printed up, white on black, tight to show off all those muscles, with a quote from Mr. Ernest Hemingway. There is no hunting like the hunting of man, and those who have hunted armed men long enough and liked it never care for anything else thereafter. Those motherfuckers used to walk the actual streets of New York, actual city, with those actual words on their actual T-shirts, and no one in authority said shit. No one believed the reports of their brutality. No one saw fit to ask why a peace officer sworn to uphold the law would be walking around wearing a shirt like that. Those gentlemen of the law, they invented a new kind of stop and frisk, called it social rape. A social rape is when you're walking down the street, minding your own business, when along comes a squad of these SCU types. Maybe they're wearing their literary type T-shirts, and they grab you, and they strip you mother naked right there on the sidewalk, balls swinging, cock out, and then they bend you over and they grease up your asshole and stick a gloved finger up it, right there, right on the street, right in front of your friends, in front of your wife, in front of your kids. There has never been a group of heterosexual men more interested in the contents of the assholes of black men than those fine police officers of the SCU. Social rape. Can you believe that? Your Sergeant Bianchi, he's had his fingers in a lot of assholes. Not mine, but on the block he was always the one who would make a show of snapping on that blue glove there, looking around, making sure everyone saw him do it, especially the fellow he was getting ready to search. Like the Spanish Inquisition, the old showing of the instruments, making sure the victim knows what's about to happen to him, giving him a long moment to think about it, anticipate it. Your Sergeant Bianchi is a grade A sadistic son of a bitch, and I promise you NYPD knew about it. But that motherfucker was still driving around with his gun and badge, with a promotion, and this week he crippled me for life, and now I'm facing prison time, real time, if I don't drop my complaint against him. For that son of a bitch to be doing what he's doing, there have to be a lot of people in on it. The DA, the judge, his commanding officer, the other cops in the cruiser with him. Bianchi isn't any rotten apple. He's a prototype, Mr. Eagle, the very model of a modern major bushwhacker, and you can tell because every time he did it, he got promoted. He's how things are supposed to work. So you'll forgive me if I'm just not all that interested in how you feel about the injustice of seeing me lying out on the ground while Sergeant Bianchi and his pals beat me nearly to death for no reason at all. Robinson's heart rate was elevated, and his hands were trembling very slightly. The American Eagle kept on drubbing his thumb on the table, wondering whether there was anything he could say that wouldn't make things worse. "I'm sorry," he ventured at last. "Yeah, I could tell you are. But I'm not an act of contrition. I'm a human being, and this is my life you're playing with." He thought about that, really thought. The American Eagle knew a lot of secrets and had seen a lot of things that no one had seen, and things that very, very few people had seen, but he rarely had cause to think about them, not this way. I'm really sorry. I have never asked you what you wanted me to do, and that was stupid and arrogant. Can I ask now? Robinson grunted and quirked his neat mustache in an embryonic smile. You just figured that out, huh? Guess being a man of steel means that you get rusty round the brains. The eagle smiled back. I suppose that's true. At least I can't argue with it, given the way things are going now. Well, the thing is, the time to ask me what I wanted from you was before you created this situation. I would have told you to record it, put the video on YouTube, give it to my lawyer. Now, yeah. Robinson had a beautiful smile, even with a broken tooth and a fat lip. They're raising money for a lawyer, I hear. People who heard about me because of what you did. So there's that. Course, I might not need that money if you'd thought before jumping in. But money for a lawyer's always better than no money and no lawyer. Public defender, all they do is tell you to plea out, save their caseloads. That's about what I've heard. The American Eagle looked at his drubbing thumb. Look, can I get you anything? Something to make you comfortable while you wait on an appeal for your bail hearing? Food, money, a pillow? Robinson shook his head, then thought a while. Will you take a note to my daughter? I only get to see her alternate weekends, and I'm going to miss our next one. Of course, the Eagle said. I can get you some paper and a pencil and pick it up tomorrow. I'd like that, Robinson said. They stared awkwardly at one another. I'm really sorry. Yeah, I know you are. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Eagle. Tomorrow, Mr. Robinson. The American Eagle got word that the protesters were massing by tuning in to a drive-time traffic report. He'd deliberately avoided them when he'd attended the bail hearing, staying too high to be seen with the naked eye until he could land on the roof of a skyscraper that overlooked the courthouse, then powering down to the courthouse roof in seconds, a streak in the sky that came to an abrupt halt with millimeters to spare. Then he'd used the stairs to get to the courtroom. But the protesters had never really gone away. The crowd at the courthouse was dwarfed by the crowd that marched from the Staten Island Borough Hall. Ugh, Borough Hall. I don't know why I'm having a hard time saying that.
It's all these boroughs. Got the Staten Island borough, you got the other horrible boroughs, you got the boroughs where the people live, you got the boroughs where other people live, you got the house, you got the precinct house, and you got the hall.
I don't know why I can't say Borough Hall. There we go. We did it. But the protesters had never really gone away. The crowd at the courthouse was dwarfed by the crowd that marched from the Staten Island Borough Hall to the precinct house every night during rush hour, snarling traffic and raising a chorus of horns that the drive-time newscasters loved to get in the background as they aired call-ins from furious drivers who wanted to condemn the whole affair. From Wilbur Robinson,
The police don't do that if you're just minding your own business. When are we going to get the whole story about what happened that day?
to the protesters, those bums want to help the blacks. Why don't they teach them some skills so they can get jobs? And especially the Eagle.
Never liked the Toad. Who knows what he really stands for is all I'm saying. It sure ain't law and order, I can tell you that much.
But the protests got bigger every day, not smaller. They're bussing in protesters from out of state now. Agitators. Russians are getting those people all fired up with fake Facebook news. And the longer the protests went on, the more of a coalition they became. Undocumented immigrant solidarity groups, anarchists in ski masks, Occupy veterans, carrying anti-capitalist slogans, Marxists with newspapers that no one wanted to read. Traffic on Staten Island had turned into a running joke. The bike racks around the ferry docks were jammed as commuters stopped even trying to get a car to and from home. The hot dog vendors were doing a land office business. The cops were pissed and had arrested dozens of people on the bullshittiest of charges: littering, spitting, and, of course, stop and frisked public displays of marijuana. They were halfway to the precinct house by the time he touched down on a gas station roof to get a look at things. There were cops all over the place. He spotted snipers on some of the other roofs. They didn't spot him. A portable guard tower on a cherry picker loomed over the intersection the protesters were filing through, ostentatiously studded with CCTVs and antennas that were doubtlessly hoovering up information from every working phone for a mile around. "No justice, no peace," was the chant, and there was a school marching band in the protest, white uniforms with silver piping and tall hats, drumming time for the chanters, brass bells of their horns raising in unison to blat out a golden note for each stanza. A kid with shoulders like a linebacker oomped on a sousaphone, walking up and down a major scale that gave the marchers a bounce in their steps. Man, this is my kind of crowd.
Not to get all political or nothing, but these are my people, man.
The eagle yearned to join them, but of course he didn't. When you're the American eagle, everything you do means something, and he'd known that for the long years he'd spent among humans. Just once he'd allowed himself to forget that, and look where it had got him. The protesters filed through the intersection, bouncing and chanting, laughing and horsing around, and unsuccessfully selling Marxist newspapers. The eagle could hear the high-pitched, encrypted whine of the police radio, sense its volume even if he couldn't decrypt it and understand its message. He gradually became aware that it was growing, rising to a squeal that ratcheted through his skull like a dentist drill. He looked around him, varying his focus to peer down the long avenues, but he couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Finally, he took to the sky, just to get a better vantage. He went up along the back of an apartment block, following the course of its ventilation shaft where there were no windows, then crested the roof and saw the source of all the chatter. The NYPD had amassed an army. Down the streets of Staten Island, there trundled columns of MRAPs, armored personnel carriers that were basically gunless tanks. These ones bore water cannons and the telltale dishes of active denial systems, pain rays that would make you feel like your face was being incinerated from the inside out. Microwaves, I believe, are traditional. He'd seen them used on crowds in Afghanistan, watched crowds of protesters trample each other as they were overwhelmed by the unbearable sensation of being roasted alive. He hadn't been happy to be on the same team as the people wielding that machine, but they were fighting the Taliban, and that was a team he definitely didn't want to be on. Watching these devices get wheeled into position for use on New Yorkers did something to the American eagle. He'd seen striking New Yorkers beaten up by Pinkertons, watched the Stonewall uprising from a nearby vantage point, flown back from Syria in time to help dig survivors and bodies out of the rubble of the Twin Towers. He'd rescued trapped secretaries and CEOs from stuck elevators in blackouts, and plucked people out of the waves during Sandy. He'd seen New Yorkers scared, brave, defiant, beaten, noble, and cowardly, and he'd never once wondered which side he was on. Now he had to choose a side between New York and New Yorkers. "Shit," he whispered. The American eagle didn't swear. He watched as a column swung around a corner to block Stuyvesant Place, a block ahead of the protesters. Another column swung into place behind the protesters, hemming them in. NYPD cops in full battle dress, armor, visors, shields, helmets, conspicuous gas masks, marched in military ranks between the MRAPs and the police buses behind them, banging their batons on their shields, chanting, "Whose streets? Our streets!" which was a pretty tasteless sort of joke in the Eagle's view. Hardly serve and protect. The protesters pulled up short and looked around. The music died. They started to hold up their phones, aiming their lenses at the cops, recording and streaming, sending up a squeal of electromagnetic noise that made the eagle wince until he damped it. A baby cried. Another, and then some of the younger kids. The cops thumped their shields.
Whose streets? Our streets!
The kid with the bass drum gave it an experimental thump, then another, then set up a booming rhythm. Boom, 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 and the snare kicked in, and then the cymbals crashed, and
Whose streets? Our streets!
and the protesters started marching in place, adding the tromp of their feet to the defiant music. The column ahead of them lurched forward, the MRAPs with their huge squared-off dishes revving their engines and slow rolling, the ranks of masked and helmeted cops pacing them from behind and between. From a bullhorn on the cherry-picker guard tower, "Clear the area!" It was tooth-rattlingly loud, and obviously farcical, because the protesters were fully boxed, with no way to go forward or back. The sound made the babies start crying again. The band picked up the tempo, and the chant split. "No justice, no peace!" and "Whose streets? Our streets!" in counterpoint, coming together on the ease in peace and eats in streets, getting funkier.
Clear the area immediately!
The column behind the protesters started to roll too. The chant wasn't just defiance, it was courage too, a way to keep the group together, to stop it from becoming a terrified mob. The drumming got faster. Phone cameras all around, trained on the faceless visors, the remorseless rolling armor. Parents scooped up their children. Some sought refuge deep in the crowd. Others stayed at the edge, where it would be easier to run. The columns halted again. The American Eagle could see the buses rolling into position behind the officers. Enough buses, he thought, to take every one of these people off to jail. He'd let them take Wilbur Robinson off to jail, trusted that his moral authority would hold the system to account, force it to reckon fairly with the kind of person it was accustomed to treating with utmost unfairness. Should he let the NYPD take the rest of these people, hundreds of them, off to jail too? His body answered before his mind was able to consciously formulate its response, taking flight and interposing itself between the protesters and the forward column. The active denial system wouldn't be able to hurt him. That he was sure of. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at him. Chanters and musicians, protesters and cops. The guy in the sniper nest had the presence, or absence, of mind to point his rifle at the American Eagle. The Eagle didn't like that. No one should be pointing firearms in a crowded city. Not an American city. Not New York City. "Put it down," he barked. He could do drill sergeant better than any USMC top kick, and when he projected, he could raise his voice to a volume that would leave a human's ears ringing. He was that loud now. The sniper twitched involuntarily, and the Eagle saw his finger tighten on the trigger, but he was able to check the reflex before he fired. Good. The Eagle glowered at the cops on the line. Their tilted, visored faces looked blankly back at him. "These people have my safe passage for their peaceful protest. You will disperse your column and stand down. If there is any outbreak of civil unrest, you will be permitted to deal with it in a measured, proportionate way. You will not use those less lethal weapons." The silence was broken by the whooping of an overhead news chopper, then another, then 3 NYPD choppers. The phone cameras on the ground tracked the cameras beneath the helicopters overhead. The world was watching. The American Eagle was doing something he'd done often when Taliban irregulars tried to stop girls from going to school, or Thai troops rushed an uprising of democracy activists. Americans had cheered the footage of these intercessions. Would they cheer when he checked the rush of New York's finest? He had a strong suspicion that they wouldn't. Some of the kids in the crowd were cheering, though, and among the grown-ups some of the tension had dissipated. Even a few of the cops seemed to be relieved, judging from their armor-obscured body language. Only a psycho would have been looking forward to what had seemed inevitable a moment before. The cops were all looking up at him through their visors. He looked back, and one of the cops gave him the nod, a respectful gesture of thanks. He was the American Eagle again, hero of a nation, defender of all that was right and good. The news networks slaughtered him. No one had the footage of the crowd before the cops showed up, so instead they used B-roll of protests that had turned violent, then long lens shots of the cops' armor columns moving in on the protesters, then the American Eagle intimidating the NYPD with his superhuman powers, letting these apparent lawbreakers go free. Activist Twitter was a little kinder, but even the people who praised him for intervening to uphold Americans' rights against one of their own police forces always had an implied or explicit "finally" in their tweets.
This is a declaration of war, said a talk radio blowhard. This monster from the stars styles himself the American Eagle, but he is no American. He isn't even human. He has no allegiance to our planet nor our species, let alone this country. We got into bed with an extraterrestrial creature, and now we've got to figure out how to divorce him. This isn't a comic book. We don't have any handy kryptonite lying around. This has got to be our top priority now. Our country cannot be said to be secure while it is in conflict with an unstoppable, inhuman super being.
Conspiracy Twitter was a dumpster fire. There had always been low-key conspiracy theories about the Eagle, going back centuries. He was a demon summoned by Freemasons to subjugate America. He was a secret laboratory experiment gone horribly wrong, or sometimes exactly right. He was a special effect created by hologram projectors or AI-based video doctoring algorithms, and the people who claimed to have seen him were hypnotized, or crisis actors, or special effects themselves. Then Bruce asked to see him and brought along a small, air-gapped tablet on which he'd stored PDFs of the Intellipedia entries about the Eagle, along with their edit histories, as NSA analysts and private sector contractors from Booz Allen and Palantir and SAIC debated their own conspiracy theories about his use as a secret Chinese, or European, or Russian, or private sector crime syndicate asset, and what someone might have offered him or threatened him with in order to turn him. "This is insane," the Eagle said. Bruce had arranged the rendezvous for one of his safe houses, the penthouse of a willowy 90-story building that was almost entirely empty, consisting of unoccupied condos that served as safe deposit boxes in the sky for offshore criminals. It was Bruce's place, so the generic designer showroom furniture slid aside to allow access to arms caches, a small operating theater, and a BDSM dungeon that was meant to be discovered by anyone who went looking for the dark secret of the billionaire playboy's playpen. Not insane, just professionally paranoid. You know these people. You've spent decades around them. What the fuck did you think was going to happen? Bruce didn't swear often. It made the Eagle anxious. Bruce. He held up his hands. Just stop. He turned to stare out the window, silvered on the other side for privacy, and looked into infinity over the rooftops of Midtown Manhattan. They know about Lois. He whispered it, and a normal human wouldn't have heard it. The Eagle heard it just fine. Lois who? He turned back and glared. Don't fuck around, Eagle. They know where you live. They know who you are when you aren't with... They know who you are when you aren't the American Eagle. They know who you spend time with. They know about Lois. He muttered a number. 10 digits. The American Eagle's social security number. The latest one. The one that was supposed to be ironclad. They're the NSA, asshole. You think that your OPSEC is up to defeating them? They figured all this shit out years ago. It's their job. Your little games can't beat their facial recognition, their pattern analysis. How do you know all this, Bruce? The eagle was angry, something he wasn't used to, but that had become more familiar just lately. Don't answer that. I know. It's because you sold them the tools, right? Bruce didn't have to answer. Part of him knew this, of course, the same way that he knew that the NRO could reconstruct his flight paths and that there were government labs where generations of scientists had studied his hair follicles and shed skin cells. But it's one thing to be known, and another to be scrutinized. Another thing altogether to be the subject of a plan of attack. Look, Eagle, all I'm trying to say is that you have set yourself on a path that cannot possibly end well. The best case scenario right now is pretty terrible, and it only gets worse from here. I told you I'd hire a good lawyer for Robinson, and I have. The best. What about all those protesters who were about to have their faces roasted by an active denial ray? Do they get lawyers too? Bruce made a pained face. You know that's not how it works. I imagine you know, so I'll take your word for it. You make them, don't you? Just another service your family business provides to the municipal, state, and national governments of the world. Bruce shook his head. America has a legitimate interest in defending itself. Would you rather the troops in Afghanistan use AR-15s? Should the NYPD be firing rubber bullets or live ammo? Maybe they shouldn't shoot at anyone. Are you volunteering to fight every one of America's wars and police all of its streets? I know you're superhuman, Eagle, but you're not omnipotent. So long as American cops and soldiers are going to be war fighting and crime fighting, they're going to need tools to support them. I'm not going to let you make me feel like a supervillain for supplying them with those tools. The American Eagle knew what was supposed to happen next. He was supposed to acknowledge that no one could be held responsible if someone else misused the things they made or distributed. It was the argument about the Taliban fighters that the CIA had armed in Afghanistan, and it was the argument about Sergeant Bianchi's buddies on the line with their face-roasting rays. He'd heard this argument so many times. Only a very unreasonable person could possibly object to it. He wasn't in a mood to be reasonable. It doesn't really matter to me whether you feel like a supervillain or not. All that matters to me is that there were armed cops about to torture peaceful protesters, including children, with a weapon you sold them. If I hadn't sold them, someone else... He held up his hands. I'm not even going to dignify that with a response, Bruce. No more than you would if it were some pimp explaining why he'd turned out a teenager to peddle her ass on the street. They glared at each other. Finally, Bruce sighed and looked away. We're on the same side. Literally, we have stood side by side, fighting together. I'm not telling you this because I want to be an asshole. I understand where you're coming from. It's a big, messy, imperfect world, and we're a messy, imperfect species. I know there's plenty of times when I want to start knocking heads together, and I'm a human being. I can't imagine how frustrating this must be for you. The American Eagle had been living among humans when Bruce's grandfather was in diapers. He'd loved humans, saved humans, fought for them. When supervillains taunted him for being an alien, he'd laughed at their clumsy speciesism, their unfounded belief that he was insecure about his status as an honorary H-SAP. H-SAPE. Why should he have any anxiety on that score? I'm pretty good at coping with it, Bruce. I've had a lot of experience. Bruce's expression made it clear that experience was no substitute for 23 chromosomal pairs in a leftward twisting corkscrew. Look, Eagle, all I'm trying to say is that if your goal is to make sure that Wilbur Robinson gets a fair trial, you're not achieving that goal. If your job is to muster public sentiment for police accountability, you're really not achieving that goal. I will stipulate that you're right about everything, but this isn't about right and wrong. You can be right, or you can be effective. Being effective means not reminding the entire human race that you are an unstoppable spaceman who only follows the rules when it suits you. As soon as you start reminding them of that fact, it will become the focus. So what do you think I should do? Bruce looked away again. You need to back off. Just disappear for a while, years, Decades, maybe. You have no idea how panicked they are out there in Spookland. There's plenty of people who never trusted you. I don't think you understand how much your champions have stuck their necks out for you over the years. That's over now. Maybe forever, Eagle. You have really fucked this up. Back off, huh? Look, if it's about Lois, I can fix that. I'll talk to them. She's a non-combatant, and she's press. There's plenty of ugly possibilities if they move on her. I'll protect her. I'll also keep paying for Wilbur Robinson's lawyers. We're appealing the bail decision. Filed today, and we've leaned on a clerk to get a hearing this afternoon. We're asking for permission to get him to the Mayo Clinic to see an orthopedic surgeon about his leg. That's how you think this should all be taken care of, huh? Bruce nodded solemnly. Running headfirst into the system doesn't change the system, it just gives you a headache. If you want justice for Wilbur Robinson, this is the most expedient and reliable approach. What about Sergeant Bianchi? He knew the answer. Bruce made a sour face. That guy is a piece of shit for sure. I talked to the commissioner. They're going to offer him a buyout, enough to make it worth his while to take early retirement. Going to call it partial disability for his PTSD from, you know. He looked pointedly at the eagle. So he gets rich and walks away a free man? Without a badge, without a gun, without his police union behind him. Without a criminal record. Without any problems getting a job as a cop somewhere else, or in private security. Without recognition that he'd done anything wrong. Bruce shook his head. Be realistic. This is the best we can hope for right now. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I'll take it under consideration. Bruce grabbed him by the shoulders and stared into his eyes. Don't fuck this up, Eagle. I know you've been doing this for a long time, but things are different now. No one cares about what you did a century ago, but they'll remember what you did last week for a long time. Don't make it worse. The eagle didn't say anything. He'd never kept a scrapbook of all his accomplishments. It would be a hell of a clue if anyone ever found it. But other people had, and he'd seen them go for top dollar on eBay in fierce bidding among collectors who would pay thousands for albums of yellowing newspaper clippings and autographed headshots, generations worth of lives saved, wrongs righted, villains vanquished. Think about this story, Eagle. Once he was our hero, but then something went wrong with him, and he became our greatest threat. You are stronger than any of us, and you can fly and see through walls. But you don't have superpowers of persuasion. The people who are pissed off at you, that's their superpower. They can convince people of anything, and you have got them scared. And you don't want to pit your superpowers against theirs. They have the kinds of powers you can't just punch out. The Eagle had met propagandists over the years, letting them talk him into posing for photo ops, delaying missions until the cameras could be rolled into position. They'd always struck him as unrealistically confident about their own abilities, but on the other hand, it was hard to argue with the results. Why would the NSA want to stick up for dirty NYPD cops? Bruce smiled. It's not so much that they stick up for them, but imagine the kinds of countermeasures you're fielding against New York's finest being used against the same weapons systems in Kandahar province. If you can neutralize those systems, then you have to be neutralized. That made perfect, terrible sense. The eagle had an untethered feeling of dread and remorse, and the carefully suppressed fear that he'd burned the wrong bridge bubbled up. You can make sure Lois is safe? Please don't do anything stupid, Eagle. You can keep her safe, though. Eagle, Bruce, I need to know if you can keep her safe. He sighed. I can keep her safe. The American Eagle nodded his thanks and launched himself off the balcony. The demonstration in support of Sergeant Bianchi was the whitest, raggediest gathering he'd ever seen in New York. Angry guys, older guys, a smattering of alt-right kids with hipster haircuts, a few glowering skinheads, some open-carry nutjobs, and veterans in uniform. At the front, ranks of cops in dress uniforms, seemingly okay with being part of the same crowd as people carrying placards with openly racist slogans. Not to mention the arts and crafts squad who'd whipped up an effigy of the American eagle out of wheat paste and tempura paints. He watched them from a rooftop 40 stories above them, too far for any human eye to discern him, close enough that he could read their lips as they chanted,
Hey, hey, it's the USA! Bug-eyed monsters, go away!
He hadn't heard the phrase bug-eyed monster since the 1980s, and even then it had been an anachronism. But these guys, all guys, were the anachronism squad. They marched from City Hall to DHS headquarters on Varick Street. Sorry, there's a line break there. They marched from City Hall to DHS headquarters on Varick Street, and the cops lined the steps, facing out, an honor guard behind the speakers, while the crowd stood on the plaza, facing back and listening as they were harangued by megaphone. Onlookers looked on from around the edges, some jeering and others cheering. The American Eagle had been marched against before. Al-Shabaab had organized mass street protests, mandatory protests, against his presence in Somalia, filling town squares with thousands of half-hearted chanters, firing their weapons into the sky as punctuation for their denunciations. He'd flown into some of these, catching the bullets in his bare hands and letting them trickle down over the stage, turning aerial cartwheels that made the kids, and even some of the grown-ups, giggle, driving the militants into furies that would have been terrifying for the crowd if not for the American Eagle's imperviousness to their rages and bullets, and his ability to protect the crowd from reprisals. Could he do that again here? Would the NYPD open fire on him right there in Greenwich Village? He doubted it. Even Bianchi had more common sense than that. Sergeant Bianchi liked to do his dirty work when the cameras were off. When the cameras were rolling, he was performatively aggrieved, a spat-upon soldier who had tried to do his duty and been punished for it. He was saying as much now, from his perch on top of the stairs, into the megaphone he'd been given, and while he wasn't the most articulate orator the Eagle had ever heard, he knew his crowd. The Eagle spotted the counter-demonstrators when they were still 2 blocks away. They were a lot browner than the Bianchi crowd, but by no means entirely brown. A New York mix, multiracial, well-dressed, funky, with signs that were much funnier than "Bug-eyed monsters, go away." At their front, walking with a cane, was Wilbur Robinson, his expression fixed in a mask that might have been fear and might have been determination. He set their pace, so they went slow, and soon there were cruisers pacing them, and the news of their impending arrival reached the police demonstrators as one after another they checked their text messages or put their heads together to talk. The people on the street recognized Wilbur Robinson, took pictures. A few trickled in to join the march. The mass worked its way slowly toward the cops, and when they turned the corner so that both camps could see each other, they all stiffened noticeably. Bianchi stopped talking into his megaphone and squinted at them, made a face like he'd just smelled a fart. He tried to pick up his speech from where he'd left off, fumbled with his notes. No one was paying any attention anyway. Wilbur Robinson led his column of marchers toward the mass of white cops and Nazis and closeted racists and authoritarians. The Nazis, there were only a dozen of them, chanted a slogan that contained the N-word, drawing attention from news cameras and people's phones. Everyone around them edged away, not wanting to be captured in the same shot as someone openly using a slur that they more commonly reserved for private company. From the Eagle's vantage point, the little clot of white polo shirt-wearing Nazis with their red armbands looked like the pupil of a great seething eye of pro-cop demonstrators. The two camps were now close enough that they looked like they might merge. The on-duty cops, who had only a moment before been raptly listening to Sergeant Bianchi's fumble-tongued speech about
protecting decent people and social justice warriors who'd let animals run wild and telling it like it is,
started to move between them to serve as a buffer. Wilbur Robinson continued to walk forward slowly, relentlessly, until he ran up against the uniformed police lines.
"Excuse me, sir, may I get past, please?"
The American Eagle could read his lips from his vantage point, but even if he hadn't been able to, Robinson's body language was plain to see. The uniformed cop didn't budge. The counter-protesters started to chant, "Let him pass! Let him pass!" Bianchi, megaphone in hand, standing on the steps, looked confused and angry. He'd lost control over the scene, and now he looked foolish and cowardly, a pumped-up gym jockey backed by a rank of dress-uniformed cops, protected by another rank of regular uniformed cops, all to keep him from being confronted by a slender black man with a cane. Like a sleepwalker, he drifted down the stairs, walking slowly through the crowd, which parted for him, all eyes on him, until he was standing on the other side of the cops who blocked Robinson's way.
"You got something to say to me?"
His back was to the Eagle, but his body language spoke volumes, and the words were picked up on the open mic of his bullhorn. He fumbled with it, but before he could click it off, Robinson spoke.
"I want you to know that I'm not going to give up."
The cop between Robinson and Bianchi shifted uneasily.
"Are you threatening me?"
Robinson considered this for a long moment.
"I expect I am, Sergeant Bianchi. You are a disgrace to your uniform. When you dragged me out of my car and crippled me, you committed a crime. When you lied about it, you committed another one. When your friends covered up for you, they committed a crime. The fact that you're standing here whining, and I'm out on bail and facing 35 years in prison, means that there's no justice at all in this city. Someday, people are going to realize that. Someday, enough white folks, enough rich white folks, are going to realize that living in a lawless city where hooligans like you can administer beatings and then get your victims locked up for the crime of complaining about it is no good for them. But long before then, everyone else is going to wake up to that fact. Brown people, white people, Chinese people, and Puerto Ricans, and everyone else. They're going to see that you are proof that the system is broken beyond repair, that you and all your friends can't be reformed into something that New York can tolerate. When that day comes, it's going to be you and your hooligan friends against all of New York City, and you will lose that fight, Sergeant Bianchi. So, yes, I expect that I am a threat to you, and nothing you do will change that. Lock me up, I'll be a threat to you. Set me free, I'll be a threat to you. It's not over, Sergeant Bianchi, but this is the beginning of the end for you, if not for the hooliganism you represent. I don't give up. I always get my man. Incredibly, Bianchi hadn't had the good sense to turn off his megaphone during this exchange, and the sound ricocheted off the building and into the hungry mics of the phones aimed at the pair. Bianchi was good at being a tough guy, but he was no good at being a calm guy. He bulged, veins in his forehead and throat, the point of his jawbone as he flexed and ground it, his neck red and straining at his collar. He clicked his megaphone off with a hand that visibly shook. Wilbur Robinson smiled serenely at the rage-filled cop, knowing that there was a decent chance he was about to get hit, knowing that if such a thing were to come to pass, there would be chaos. Wilbur Robinson had run out of fucks to give about chaos. So had the American Eagle. He silently cheered on Wilbur Robinson, joining in with the loud cheers from the counter-demonstrators who'd been held behind police lines. After the mic was off, Bianchi called Wilbur Robinson a name that included the N-word.
He was in profile to the American eagle, but the mouth shapes were unmistakable, as was the reaction of the counter-demonstrators who saw it and perhaps heard it. Bianchi wasn't a quiet man. Robinson's smile didn't waver. He said only one word, or perhaps he only mouthed it. Coward. That's when Sergeant Bianchi slugged him. The American Eagle didn't intervene in the ensuing riot. There were cops on the scene, and they at least were conscious of the cameras on them, even if Bianchi wasn't. He watched as the police pulled apart the struggling bodies, separated them into two camps, forcing them behind hastily installed sawhorses. A skinhead threw a bottle over the police line into the midst of the counter-demonstrators, who dodged it. When it shattered, some of the glass cut a small child. She was no more than 5 or 6, and her wails made everyone look at her. While their attention was elsewhere, the skinhead flipped the bird with both hands and then melted into the crowd. The eagle tracked him and considered swooping down to grab him. Wilbur Robinson was sitting on the ground, being attended to by an EMT who was shining lights into his eyes and carefully feeling him from toes to skull for fractures and sprains. Reading his lips, the eagle saw that he was repeating, "I'm okay, I'm okay," although Bianchi had given him a black eye that was swelling up despite the EMT's ice pack. Robinson eventually pushed the EMT away and struggled to his feet. A younger man, one of the counter-demonstrators, dressed in a narrow-lapelled black suit, neat hair, and wire rims, like a latter-day Malcolm X, rushed to help him. They conferred briefly, and he called out to a friend who brought him another megaphone. Robinson lifted it to his lips.
Officers, I would like to swear out an assault complaint against Geoffrey Bianchi. I would
like you to arrest him and charge him. I have many witnesses here who saw him attack me, including each and every one of you. He stared at them, mildly, unblinkingly. Please do your duty. Not one cop moved. He brought the bullhorn back to his lips. Sergeant Geoffrey Bianchi, I place you under citizen's arrest. He walked toward the cop, who planted his feet and stuck his chin out. Please come with me. Bianchi shoved him, and his cane flew out into the crowd as he windmilled his arms. Slowly, he got back to his feet. The younger man brought him his cane. He walked toward Bianchi again. Again, Bianchi shoved him. This time he cracked his head on the pavement and sat up slowly, obviously dizzy, rubbing his head gingerly. The young man helped him back to his feet. People around, not just the counter-demonstrators, but the spectators too, and there were more of those every minute, shouted at him, cheering him, telling him not to get hurt, calling Bianchi a coward, exhorting the cops around them to do something. The cops exchanged nervous looks. An officer arrived in a cruiser with its siren and lights going and made his way to Bianchi. He spoke too quietly to be heard, even by the American Eagle. Bianchi shook his head once and started walking toward Robinson. He bunched his fists together and got ready to swing. The Eagle could see it would be a hell of a blow. With all of the muscle Bianchi had put on pumping iron, the kind of thing that could break Robinson's jaw. The Eagle was about to leap off the building and arrow down to intercept the blow when a hand in an armored glove caught Bianchi's wrist and held it. Bianchi tried to swing and just succeeded in knocking himself off balance, dangling from Bruce's iron grip as Bruce stared down at him from within his cowl. He shook his head slowly, keeping eye contact with Bianchi. Bianchi had gone pale, from surprise or from the pain of his wrist bones grinding together, the Eagle couldn't say which. Bruce spoke, lips visible beneath the peaked nose guard of his cowl.
Don't do that.
He released Bianchi's wrist with a snarl and let him fall to the ground, and before he hit, Bruce was already stalking toward the captain, his cape billowing behind him.
Do your goddamn job,
he said, his face inches from the officer's, and then he was off, leaping onto his motorcycle and roaring off down an alley. From his vantage, the Eagle could see Bruce emerge from another alley in civvies, the bike transformed to a rusty beater that he chained to a lamp post. The Eagle supposed Bruce would send the boy out later to retrieve it. The officer led Bianchi into a cruiser, letting him sit in the front. He quickly Mirandized Bianchi while he sat, wooden-faced and fuming. The two sides looked at one another. Then, as a mass, they dissipated. The show was over for today. Oh, I'm getting a quick text message. Give me a moment. Oh, this is important. Give me a sec. Sorry about the delay. Where were we? Ah. Lois wouldn't answer her phone. After 2 days of unreturned messages, the American Eagle put on civvies and took the subway to her apartment. She didn't answer the buzzer. He started to feel a slow roil of fear and walked around back and climbed a dumpster and leapt onto the fire escape, then climbed it with convincingly human awkwardness, found Lois's window and peered in, using X-ray vision to look through the whole place, even though a quick glance showed him that the place was empty, cleaned out. Forcing himself to be calm, he called the newspaper and asked to be put through to her extension, and got a voicemail saying she was on an overseas assignment, and referring him to another reporter if he had any juicy tips. He had barely hung up the phone when it rang again. "Hi, Bruce." "She's safe, but she wanted out, so I helped her get out." "Bruce, it was her idea. She had figured it out. Had heard from her intelligence community sources that things were happening, things that could involve her. She's fine. I found her a source in a major Russian defense contractor who's willing to reveal how they spy on the oligarchs for the Kremlin. She's happy as a pig in shit over there, believe me." "She's in Russia?" "Safer than here right now. You've made enemies, you understand." "And she didn't want to talk to me about it?" "She was very adamant on the subject." There was an awkward pause. "Give it time. You have lots of that, right?" Another pause. "Or don't. Find someone else. Or take a sabbatical. You've earned it, and God knows you're not going to get much done the way things stand. You've really fucked things up." The American Eagle groped for words that wouldn't come. "Come on, don't you have a Fortress of Solitude in the Arctic or something?" "That was a promotional stunt." It had been decades since he'd relocated the remains of his landing craft to the dark side of the moon. Well, let me know if you need a place to hide out. I've got places besides Russia where you could cool off.
That's okay. I can take care of myself.
I know you can, brother. I just wish you would. Stung, the eagle hung up. Wilbur Robinson lived in a low-rise apartment building on the wrong side of Staten Island's Mason-Dixon line, with a basketball court out front and community gardens out back. His apartment was on the third floor, and he was alone in it when the American Eagle rang his bell, timing it so that there was no one on that floor anywhere near their doors, and the elevators were empty. He opened the door on the chain, took a long look at the American Eagle, then closed the door and slipped the chain and let him in. "You drink or eat?"
Not really.
"I do." Robinson's dinner was on the dining room table, a plate with a hamburger and some peas and carrots, a glass of beer next to it. He sat down at the table and took a bite of the burger and chewed it thoughtfully, staring at the eagle.
You ever hear of Emmett Till?
The eagle nodded slowly. Robinson set his burger down and rose painfully to his feet, went to a bookcase next to his TV, and got down a thick hardcover book, bristling with post-it notes with neat lettering on their protruding tongues. He peered at these, then opened the book. The American Eagle looked at the photo there reflexively, though he knew what he'd see, then looked away.
I imagine you've seen this picture.
I have. I have. I have. I have. I have. I have.
There we go. Suitable gravitas.
I have.
Emmett Till lay in a casket in his parents' living room, a 14-year-old boy in a Sunday suit, the only recognizably human parts of him beneath the suit. The head that emerged from the white, starched collar was a pulped mess, only hinting at facial features. He'd been beaten, mutilated, and dumped in a river by two white men who thought he had whistled at a white woman. The eagle remembered that moment.
I imagine you may have seen it when it was published.
I did.
It felt like an admission. Certainly, he thought he understood Robinson's point. Where were you when this happened? The two men who'd admitted to the killing had been acquitted by an all-white jury.
He was a boy, but the testimony was all about his terrifying black body and its amazing strength. It's always about terrifying black bodies, our superhuman strength, our incredible endurance. They have to keep hitting us, because when you hit us just once, we get back again. I'm told that the first anti-cocaine laws were passed after a white sheriff testified that he had to switch to higher caliber sidearms because black men weren't going down with just one shot they'd done once they'd done a line or two.
Robinson gave him a long look. As a quick aside, an addendum to that, one of the main reasons that Coca-Cola dropped cocaine from the formulation was because it had become a popular drink. It was perceived that it had become a popular drink with African Americans and other brown people. And we can't have that. So they changed the formulation. Of course, Coca-Cola to this day, at least current era Coca-Cola denies fervently that it ever had cocaine in it, but the historical records are all there, so you can't whitewash that one, guys. It's not going to work. He squirmed. Finally,
Superhuman strength isn't everything it's cracked up to be.
I wouldn't have minded it. Bet Emmett Till wouldn't have minded either.
he covered the trial for the paper, in a small way, doing man on the streets in Times Square with New Yorkers looking on in horror at the travesty in Mississippi. He'd interview these white, upstanding Northerners, and they'd say all the right words. Then his superhuman hearing would pick up what they really thought when they walked off, whispering to their friends. "Let one of them try it on my sister. They'll think that Till kid got off easy."
Bet he wouldn't have.
Mr. Eagle, I can't help but notice that you had plenty of chances to fly down to the Jim Crow South and sit at a lunch counter. I can't help but notice that you didn't do any of that, but you were moved to intervene when I was getting a beating from Sergeant Bianchi and his little gang of sadists. The Eagle nodded. Care to explain that discrepancy? The Eagle heaved a sigh. That's a question I've asked myself more than once. I guess. He trailed off. Robinson's apartment was homey, lived in, a poker mat and chips under the glass coffee table, and folding chairs peeking out of the closet, ready to be brought out and set up when there was more company than the dining room set could seat. The Eagle never had company, not even Lois. I guess I just hit my limit. Robinson looked at the photo for a long time, then closed the book. Took you long enough. The Eagle didn't know what to say to that. Robinson was right. He let himself out. From behind the closed door, he heard Robinson limp across the room to put the book away. Bianchi was taking a nap in his cruiser when the Eagle found him. His Tempe PD uniform was sweaty and rumpled, his face tanned from the Arizona sun, except for the bridge of his nose, which was sunburned. The Eagle let his shadow fall across Bianchi's face, watched him stir, then open one eye, then sit upright, reaching instinctively for his sidearm. As Bianchi woke more fully, he took his hand away, then lowered the window.
You enjoying yourself?
Not really. The Eagle hadn't worn his cape and cowl in months, not since he'd left New York. Not since the third time he'd been taunted by a human telling him to go back to where he came from. Since then, he'd been mostly walking, taking old roads that were made obsolete 75 years ago, when the interstates had gone in. He'd walked those roads before, in another time, another America. Or at least, an America whose story he selectively told himself. It felt weird to be wearing it now.
We're within 100 miles of a border. What if I asked you for proof of citizenship?
Bianchi's smile was shitty and small. Then I imagine we'd have a problem. I would have thought you'd have lost your appetite for problems.
I don't back down, not from any fight where I'm in the right. Maybe you'd get me kicked off the Tempe PD? So what? All that would mean is I'd get 2 early retirements and another pension. I hear they're hiring in Florida.
Maybe you'd go to jail this time.
Be serious, you jamoke.
The Eagle had killed hundreds of humans. What was one more? They'd never catch him. Though, of course, Bianchi's body cam was rolling. He'd have to take it with him, crush it into powder. He wouldn't leave fingerprints. He didn't have fingerprints. I don't want trouble. I just wanted to see what you'd made of yourself, whether you'd learned anything.
Unfucking believable.
Bianchi rolled up his window, blasted the AC, put the cruiser into gear. The Eagle put a hand on the hood before it could lurch into motion, held it still while the engine ground and the wheels spun. Bianchi was about to grab for his gun again. The Eagle could almost see the nerve impulse running down his arm. When the Eagle let go and the car lurched forward, throwing Bianchi against his shoulder belt. By the time Bianchi looked back, the Eagle was long, long gone. The next time he saw Wilbur Robinson, it was on YouTube. Robinson was looking better fed, and his mustache was perfectly groomed as he led a crowd that held their cameras on a cop while he frisked a young black man. The cop looked like he wanted to punch all of them out, but he didn't. It was an ugly scene, and the kid on the other end of the frisk wasn't enjoying any part of it. But the cop didn't find anything, and walked away looking furious. The Eagle thought about phoning Lois. He missed her. She hadn't returned any of his calls, though, and he knew how to take a hint. Bruce answered on the second ring. I don't think it's a good idea for us to talk anymore. Really? I have certain obligations, thanks to my relationship with the U.S. government, and they include helping them locate potential enemy combatants. Oh. There's some things America is willing to tolerate. Some things, though, I get it. He hung up. He wondered why he wasn't more upset. After thinking it through, watching the thunderheads roil beneath him as he hovered in the troposphere, he realized that what Bruce had said he'd known all along. It was why he hadn't been there when Bull Connor released the dogs, why he'd ignored all the other Wilbur Robinsons along the way. Some things America would tolerate, but other things it would never, ever forgive. And that was Model Minority by Cory Doctorow. That one's for you, Echo. And anyone else, really. Um, so yeah. It's a good one. Um, let's just take legally distinct Superman and Batman and put them in the tenor of current day, well, okay, technically 2019 day, racial politics, and see how it goes. Not well is the answer. Not very well at all for anyone involved, which is a shame. Um, of course, the Eagle can just, buzz off and chill out for a century or however long and then come back. But it's one of the less optimistic stories in in this collection, sadly. One of the less optimistic things that Cory Doctorow has done, I'd contend. There's darker. He's done darker, but this one's. I'd actually contend that the second one is maybe darker, or the second one, third one in this collection is maybe darker. And that one's going to be kind of tough for me to get through because it hits home on a personal level pretty hard. Um, this one's great though. Um, you know, for anyone else looking for DC superheroes that are trying to make good but are running up against the hard brick wall that is, or kryptonite wall that is really everything, the human condition, specifically the American condition, but the human condition in general, I highly recommend checking out. It's by Alex Ross. It is a Justice League collection of Justice League stories. It is called Alex Ross Justice League. Which one is it? Which was it? Oh, geez, that is too vague a search query. It's not Justice, I don't think. What was it called? It is bugging me now. Anyway, it's superb, at any rate. Maybe it was Justice League of America. Probably Justice League of America. Anyway, it's got some great stories in it. A good example is Superman sets forth to solve world hunger. It does not end well. Um, mostly in the sense that he's treated as well, an interloper, and he's like, I'm sick and tired of just trying to like beat up criminals or whatever. It's like I want to make an actual lasting difference. There's a similar one for Wonder Woman, striving to help women who are imprisoned or otherwise trapped in systems that don't have I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. My brain just stopped. Um, oh man, my language centers have really fallen apart. Anyway, it's really good. Batman tries to solve crime, and that doesn't really work out. He's like, he encounters a black kid on the streets and is like, stop trying to rob people. And the kid's like, I have no economic opportunities to make that happen. And Batman's like, oh shit. And then someone's like, he finally comes to the conclusion, oh shit, I'm like a multi-billionaire. I can solve things. And he's like, I'm going to throw money at the problem. And it doesn't actually fix the problem. So he's like, okay, we've got to do something different. There's some other ones as well. It's very good. I highly recommend it. Unfortunately, I can't remember its name, which is absolutely useless. So just give me a few minutes here while I try and find what it was called. Where are you? Because it's not visible from my vantage point. I have a copy. It wasn't All Stars, was it? No, no. Unfortunately, Alex Ross is like distressingly prolific. Let's go through here. Ah, here we go. I think this is it. Is this it? I think this is it. Probably my favorite story in that one is actually one about Shazam. I'm a old-timey Shazam fan. Because it's about how Shazam just wants to like. Is this it? No. Yes, this is it. Okay, what is it part of? What? So the short story for Superman was Superman Peace on Earth. It was part of a collection, and I have the collection, but I can't remember what the collection is called. It's useless. It's useless. World's Greatest Superheroes. There it is. I can get you the ISBN if need be. There it is. It's superb. It's very good. It's maybe one of my favorite superhero works ever. Partly because Alex Ross, I think, generally gets the whole DC mythos thing and having like actual gods walking on Earth, and also his art is phenomenal. Um, I'd recommend Kingdom Come, but that one's kind of an acquired taste. But it's got Alex Ross's art. You can't go wrong with Alex Ross's art. So look for The World's Greatest Superheroes by Alex Ross, and highly recommend that. Yeah. Contains the collected issues of Superman Peace on Earth, Batman War on Crime, Shazam The Power of Hope, Wonder Woman The Spirit of Truth, and Justice League of America Secret Origins 1 and Liberty and Justice. I don't remember anything from Liberty and Justice offhand, but I think that's the one where they all come together, and it's cool because that's always cool. But definitely worth checking out. I am shilling a comic work. Probably that's one that I'll try to do on stream if I can find a decent digital copy of it floating around. Because A, it's gorgeous, and B, it's just really good. All the stories in it are great. Alex Ross, I don't think, is generally all about writing really insightful stories necessarily, but he does good work in the oeuvre. Or historically has. I haven't read anything by him recently. So maybe he's changed, become a shadow of his former self. I hope not. Anyway, so that one is cute. I highly like that one. Model Minority. It's wonderful. Depressing, but nice, reflective look at the American condition, regrettable though it is. So yeah, with that, I'm going to scooch. Next week for Wednesdays, we will... how long was that one? I think that's one of the less long ones. Yeah, next week we can probably do all of Radicalized, provided I have the time. things are happening, so might not work. Radicalized is is an emotional roller coaster. So we're gonna get through that. Um, so yeah, this went on longer than I was planning on doing, but it'll be fine. Um, it'll be fine. Everything will be fine. Fine, 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 fine. But yeah, with that, I'm gonna scooch. Thanks again for tuning in. I do these live starting at noon Eastern Standard Time or East Coast US time. Um, I do other streams throughout the week. I've got a Mecha Monday stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Right now we're reading through the novelization of Mobile Suit Gundam, originally published in 1987, 89? Does this say? 87. But the edition I'm working with was republished and with some translation tweaks in '04. There is a newer edition, but I don't think it adds anything as far as I know. So we're still reading. We're reading through that. Um, and then Fridays are free read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud, which is kind of what I do on Wordy Wednesdays. I've got to come up with some quick pitch, one-liner pitch for what Wordy Wednesdays are, other than it's my float day and I do whatever. But free read Fridays, we're reading through The Fall of Hyperion, the second volume of the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. And things are probably going to start getting wild pretty soon, probably. If they weren't wild enough already, they are going to get wilder. So, good stuff. So with that, I'm going to scooch. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. Thanks. I don't ask for much. Do I? I ask a bit. I ask a bit of some people. Be decent to each other. You could get crucified saying something like that. Hey, tell you what, jeez Louise. On a crutch even. Bye-bye. Going to the Calvary. So quick aside, minor bugaboo of mine. There are two words. One is they both have the same letters in them, but they're pronounced very differently and they are spelled rather differently, and they are worlds apart. You have cavalry, which is really any mobile brigade. What is the strict definition of cavalry? Cavalry, typically on horseback, but now it can be armored. Historically, cavalry, from the French word cavalerie, it itself derived from cheval, meaning horse, are soldiers or warriors who fight mounted on horseback. They're basically mobile combat units. However, it is often confused with cavalry, who Frag can't spell because he's smart, which is traditionally known as Golgotha, the Hill of Skulls. Calvary, or Golgotha, was a site immediately outside Jerusalem's walls where, according to Christianity's four canonical Gospels, Jesus was crucified. You'll notice there's a bit of a difference in the definition of these two words, so don't get them wrong. Pronunciation does actually matter a lot. When somebody says, I'm going to call in the Calvary, I'm going to be like, why do we want to go to a hell where people are crucified? That doesn't sound like very much fun or useful to our current condition, thanks. And if you say, I'm going to make a pilgrimage to the cavalry, I'm going to be like, so you're going to, what, like a horse race? Actually, that would be really funny. I'm making my pilgrimage, I'm making a pilgrimage to the cavalry. To cavalry would be really funny as like a euphemism for going to the horse betting. I'd giggle if that was a thing. I've never heard anyone use that term as a euphemism, but it would be funny if they did. Anyway, that's frag rambling enough for today on two words that are different, that looks the same at first but aren't the same. Language is fun.